There is a kind of betrayal that does not arrive with noise. It does not come with a raised voice or a slammed door or the kind of confrontation that at least has the honesty of announcing itself. It comes quietly. It comes in a conversation you were not present for. It comes in a handshake made in a room you never entered, between a man you trusted and a man you had never met, over a future that belonged to you but was never offered to you as yours to protect. It comes in a daughter being told, not asked, told that she is getting married, that the wedding is in 3 weeks, that the man's name is Howard, that her father's debts have been settled. Some betrayals are committed by strangers. Those are the ones that leave scars you can explain to other people. You can tell the story of a stranger's betrayal and people will nod and understand and give you the particular sympathy that attaches to a wound with a clear cause and a clear perpetrator and no further complexity. But the betrayal committed by the man you called father, the man whose name you carry, whose house you grew up in, whose lap you sat on as a child when the world felt too large, that betrayal does not leave a scar you can explain to anyone. It leaves something deeper than a scar. It leaves a question you spend years trying to answer. How do you build something solid when the first foundation you ever stood on turned out to be made of something that was never yours to keep? How do you trust the next thing when the thing you trusted most turned out to have a price? And how, most importantly, most painfully, the question that sits underneath all the other questions, how do you remain yourself, fully and completely and without apology, after someone who was supposed to see your value decided instead to spend it? This story will tell you. This is the story of Adiz. And this is the story of her brother Chukwemeka, the man who found out what their father had done, who refused to look away from it, and who spent 10 years making sure his sister's story did not end where their father had decided it would. Stay with me, because this story is not just about what was taken. It is about what was built on the ruins of the taking. And what was built is extraordinary. Adiz Okonkwo was 22 years old when her father, Vincent Okonkwo, told her she was getting married. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he said it, the same table she had sat at for every meal of her childhood, the table with the scratched corner from the time her brother Emeka had pushed his chair back too hard when he was 9, the table that was so central to the geography of her earliest memories that she could not afterwards think of that table without thinking of this moment. The ordinary thing made permanently extraordinary by what happened at it. She had been doing her coursework when he came in. A final year assignment on supply chain management, the kind of work that requires you to be fully present in it, the kind that had always come naturally to Adiz because she had always been the person in any room who was most interested in how things connected. How a decision in one place became a consequence in another. How the invisible architecture of a system determined everything that was visible about it. She had her notes spread across the table and her pen in her hand, and she was in the middle of a paragraph when her father pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. She registered something in his posture, not his expression, which was composed and careful, but the particular quality of his sitting, the slight over-deliberateness of it, the way a person sits when they have been preparing to sit down for a long time before they actually do it. She set down her pen. She said, "Daddy." He said, "Adiz, I need to talk to you about something." Vincent Okonkwo was 54 years old at the time. He was a man who had spent 30 years building the impression of a man who had more than he had. Not a dishonest man in the obvious ways. He did not steal, he did not cheat in his business dealings. He paid what he owed when he was able to pay it. He was a man who believed in the importance of how things appeared and had never fully separated that belief from how things were. The house was larger than the income. The car was newer than the bank account. The clothes were better than the savings. The social life was more generous than the underlying finances could comfortably support. He had been doing this, managing the gap between appearance and reality, for so long that he had become genuinely skilled at it. Most people who knew him believed he was doing well because he had built, over decades, all the signals of doing well. The right neighborhood, the right church, the right associations, the right car in the driveway. What they did not see was the infrastructure underneath those signals, the loans taken and partially repaid and supplemented by new loans, the business investments that had seemed like the next turnaround and had not turned, the accumulation of obligations that had reached, in the 2 years before this conversation, a number that Vincent could no longer carry alone. He had known for some time that he needed a solution. He had thought about it in the specific, private way that men think about problems they are not ready to tell anyone about, turning it over in the early mornings, arriving at different possible arrangements and discarding them, working through the mathematics of what he owed and what he had and what the gap between them would require to close. He had found what he believed was a solution. Howard Mensah was 41 years old, a businessman from another city with money that was real and connections that were useful and a particular kind of desire. The desire of a man who had been married twice and divorced twice and had arrived at the conclusion that what he needed was a young wife from a good family, someone who had not yet been formed by the world into someone he could not shape. He had money and the things money could buy. He did not have what he wanted at home. He was looking for a way to acquire it. He had met Vincent through a mutual acquaintance at a business event. They had shared 3 dinners over 6 weeks, with the comfortable ease of 2 men who had each identified what the other had and were working through, in the polite language of indirect conversation, what an arrangement might look like. By the 3rd dinner, the outline was clear. By the end of the 3rd dinner, the specifics had been agreed. Howard would pay Vincent's outstanding debts, the full amount cleared, documented, done. Vincent would provide Howard with a wife from his family. The family member available was Adiz. She had not been consulted about any of this. She had not been present at any of the dinners. She had been at home, at the kitchen table, writing her supply chain assignment, entirely unaware that the 2 men were meeting and that the subject of their meetings was her. Her father told her that evening. He said, "You are going to marry a man named Howard Mensah. He is a good man. He has money. He will take care of you. The wedding is in 3 weeks. This is decided." Adiz sat very still. The stillness was not shock exactly. It was the particular quality she had always had of going completely quiet when something important arrived, of receiving it fully before deciding what to do with it. She had been this way since she was small. Her teachers had described it as the look of a child who is deciding something even when she appears to be doing nothing. She said, "What do you mean it is decided?" Her father said, "I mean it is decided." She said, "I have not met this man." Her father said, "You will meet him. There is time." She said, "Daddy, I am finishing my degree. I have plans. I have things I want to do with my life. I have been thinking about what comes after this degree since I started it. I have talked to you about it. You know what I want to do. Cannot just—" She stopped. She looked at his face. She had known her father's face for 22 years and she had learned, as children learn the faces of the people who matter most to them, to read it with a precision that went beyond anything she could have put into words. The particular quality of his stillness in this moment, the set of his jaw, the way he was not quite meeting her eyes, told her something she did not want to know. She said, "Is this about the debts?" Her father said nothing. She said, "Is this about money?" He said, "This is about your future." She said, "This is about your debts. Is it not?" He said, "Adiz, this is how these things are sometimes arranged. This man is a serious man. He has real money. He will provide for you in ways that a husband can provide. You will have a good life." She said, "In ways that you cannot." He said nothing. She looked at him for another moment. Then she got up from the table slowly and precisely, the way she did everything. She left her coursework spread across the table. She walked to her room. She closed the door behind her. Not slamming it, just closing it, with the deliberate quietness of someone who has decided not to perform what they are feeling. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall. She sat there for a long time. What arrived in her over those minutes was not grief, not yet, and not anger, not exactly. It was understanding. The specific, crystalline, unwanted understanding that comes when you have been holding a possibility at the edge of your thinking without letting yourself look at it directly, and then suddenly you are looking at it directly and it is exactly as bad as you were afraid it would be. Her father had sold her. Not with chains. Not in a way that history books describe or that anyone would use that word for in public. In a conversation, over dinner, between 2 men. One of whom was her father, the man who had walked her to her first day of school, who had sat in the front row at her secondary school prize, giving and clapped until his hands were red, who had told her every year of her life that she was his Ada, his brightest one, his girl who was going to do things, and another of whom was a stranger who needed a wife and had money enough to arrange for one. She sat on the edge of the bed and understood this completely. She did not cry. She had always been the child in the family who did not cry easily, It was one of the things about her that people interpreted differently depending on who they were. People who did not know her well sometimes found it unsettling. People who knew her well understood that the not crying was not absence of feeling. It was the opposite. She felt things so completely that there was no surplus left over to become tears. The feeling went somewhere else, somewhere inward and deep and very still, and became something she carried rather than expressed. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed 2 hours later when the knock came at her door. She knew the knock. She said, "Come in." It was Emeka. Chukwuemeka Okonkwo was 25 years old at the time. 3 years older than Adiz, and the relationship between them had always been the particular kind of sibling relationship that happens when two people who happen to share parents also happen to find, as they grow, that they have actively chosen each other. They were different in their personalities. Emeka was louder where she was quiet, more openly combative where she was strategic, more likely to speak a thing directly where she would hold it until she knew what it was. But they operated as a unit in the way of people who have understood, somewhere along the way, that the world will try to separate them and that the correct response to that attempt is to remain connected. He had been out when their father spoke to Adiz. He had come home to a house that felt different in the specific way houses feel different when something significant has happened inside them, a quality of held breath, of charged air. He had seen his father in the sitting room watching television with the particular blankness of a man who is not watching television but is doing something else with his eyes. He had registered this and felt the particular alertness that he had always felt when something was wrong in his family and no one was naming it yet. He had gone to Adiz's door. She let him in. She told him everything in the same sequential, flat, precise way she had processed it. This happened, then this, not dramatizing, just narrating. The dinner she had not been told about, the arrangement she had not been asked about, the man she had not met, the wedding in 3 weeks, the debts that had been cleared. Emeka sat on the chair at her desk and listened to all of it without interrupting. This was notable because Emeka was not a person who found it easy not to interrupt. He interrupted frequently when things did not matter. When things mattered, he was completely still. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The quiet had a quality. She could feel him working through it, the way she sometimes felt the weather changing before she could see any evidence of it. She waited. Then he said, "He cannot do this." She said, "He has already done it. The wedding is in 3 weeks. Howard Mensah has paid. The debts are settled." Emeka said, "Adiz, he cannot do this." She looked at her brother. There are people in this world who say things they believe but do not mean, who use words as expression rather than commitment, who speak conviction without intending to act on it. Emeka had never been one of those people. When he said something, he meant it with the specific weight of someone who was already calculating what the meaning required him to do. She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I am going to talk to him." She said, "I already talked to him." He said, "I am going to talk to him differently." He got up from the chair. He left her room. She heard him knock on the sitting room door. She heard the door open. She heard nothing after that because she did not go to listen. She sat on the edge of her bed and waited, the way you wait when something is happening that is happening on your behalf but that you cannot control or even fully witness. She waited for 2 hours. The conversation between Emeka and his father that night covered ground that had never been covered in that household before. Emeka had grown up in a family where certain things were understood and not said, where the maintenance of particular surfaces was treated as a collective obligation, where the gap between what was and what appeared to be was managed by everyone's collective agreement not to look at it directly. He had always found this arrangement difficult. He had been the one who named things, who said the unsayable, who paid the social cost of clarity in a family that preferred comfortable obscurity. He said to his father, "What you have done is sell your daughter." He said it in the particular way he had discovered, over years of difficult conversations, that hit harder than shouting, quietly, without heat, in the tone of someone stating a fact that is simply true and needs to be heard as such. Vincent Okonkwo sat through this and said nothing for a long time. Then he said what Emeka had expected him to say, the arguments about provision, about the reality of financial difficulty, about Howard being a serious man who would give Adiz a life that Vincent, in his current circumstances, could not provide. He said these things with the careful reasonableness of a man who had spent several weeks arranging his justifications, and was now presenting them in the order he had decided they were most persuasive. Emeka listened to all of it with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. Then he said, "I hear all of that. And none of it changes what this is." His father said, "The agreement is made. The bride price has been settled. The debts are cleared. This cannot be undone without creating a situation that is worse for everyone." Emeka said, "I understand. I am not asking you to undo it tonight. What I am telling you is this. I am going to help my sister build a life that makes what you have arranged for her look like the smallest thing that ever happened to her. And I am telling you this now so that when that life exists, and it will exist, I promise you that you will understand that you are the reason it was necessary. And you will have to sit with that." His father said nothing. Emeka stood up. He went back to his sister's room. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and sat in the chair again. He looked at her for a moment, the particular way he looked at her when he was deciding how to say something true. He said, "I could not stop it. I am sorry. Tonight I could not stop it. But I need you to hear something and I need you to believe it because I need you to carry it." She said, "What?" He said, "This is not the end of your story. I know it feels like an ending. I know what has just been arranged for you feels like a door closing on everything you were planning. It is not. I do not know exactly what comes next. I know you. I know what you are made of. And I know that whatever comes next is going to look very different from what he has arranged, because you are going to make sure of it. And I am going to help you. From wherever I am, whatever I am doing, I am going to help you. Do you hear me?" She looked at her brother for a long moment. She said, "I hear you." She meant it. She meant it as a full and considered thing, not reassurance received and set aside, but a promise accepted and stored. In the weeks and months and years that followed, she would return to that moment with the particular reliability of someone returning to a fixed point when the ground around them is uncertain. He had said it. She had believed it. And he had, in the decade that followed, made it true. The marriage to Howard Mensah happened 3 weeks later, as arranged. Adiz stood in the dress that had been chosen for her. A beautiful dress, expensive, exactly the kind of dress a man with money would want his bride to wear, and looked at the room around her from the specific interior distance of someone who is physically present and psychologically very much elsewhere. The guests were there. The food was there. The decorations were there, all correct, all exactly as such occasions are supposed to look. Her father stood at her side with an expression she chose not to examine too closely. She walked down the aisle toward Howard Mensah, a man she had met twice before the wedding day. He was handsome in a way she could objectively register without finding it relevant. He was well-dressed. He smiled at her with the warm confidence of a man who has gotten what he wanted and is pleased about it. She did not cry. She held her bouquet and looked straight ahead and walked with the particular precision of someone who has decided, in advance, that they are not going to let what is happening to them on the outside be visible on their face. She had made that decision on the edge of her bed the night her father told her. She had spent the 3 weeks between that night and the wedding reinforcing it. She was not going to perform devastation for people who had arranged the situation that was devastating her. She was not going to perform happiness for the same reason. She was going to be present and controlled and very, very attentive, because she had understood, sitting on the edge of that bed, that the most important thing she could do in whatever came next was pay attention. Howard Mensah's home was in the city where his businesses were based. A city 2 hours from where Adiz had grown up, far enough to feel like a different world, not far enough to feel impossible. The house was large and well-appointed, maintained by a staff of 4, running on a schedule that Howard had established across 2 previous marriages and had arrived at through the particular process of a man who knows what he wants from a domestic life and has gradually removed everything that does not provide it. He was not a cruel man. She established this quickly, not through any single interaction but through the accumulation of small observations across the first weeks. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not demean her in the obvious ways. He was, in many individual moments, generous and pleasant and capable of warmth when warmth was not complicated by inconvenience. He was also not a man who had thought carefully about what he was doing when he arranged this marriage. He had thought about what he wanted: a young wife from a good family who would manage his household, attend his social events, present well, and require from him the minimum of adaptation. He had not thought about the fact that what he had purchased with his payment of Vincent Okonkwo's debts was not actually a person designed to fit those requirements, but a specific individual human being who had her own interior life and her own plans and her own considerable intelligence, all of which existed entirely independently of what he had paid for and none of which were going to disappear because he had preferred not to factor them in. He reduced her by degrees. This is the precise word for what happened, and it is important to use it correctly. He reduced her, compressed her, made her smaller than she was, not through any single act of cruelty but through the accumulated weight of small preferences that were never stated as rules but were enforced through the particular mechanism of a man who was used to his preferences being accommodated. When he expressed a preference, the household accommodated it. Adiz was part of the household. The business degree she had been finishing when the marriage was arranged. She was not told she could not complete it. There was never a prohibition, never a direct instruction. It simply became very difficult to complete. The household required her. The social calendar required her. The management of a domestic life at the scale Howard maintained, staff, vendors, events, relationships, correspondence, required constant attention from someone who understood it well enough to do it well. Adiz understood it well within 3 months and did it excellently. The degree set. She did not work. This had also not been stated as a prohibition. Howard simply made clear, in the indirect way he made everything clear, that he preferred she did not. He was a man who associated his wife's occupation of her own professional life with the deficiencies of his previous marriages. Both wives had been working women, and both marriages had ended, and he had arrived at the correlation without examining it very carefully and had decided that the correct variable to eliminate was the working. He was generous with the household allowance. He was generous at occasions. He gave Adiz everything except time that was her own and space to fill it with anything he had not preselected. She managed the household. She attended the functions. She looked exactly as good beside him as he had hoped when he sat across the dinner table from her father and made the arrangement. She did all of it with the specific quality she had always brought to things that required her full attention. Completely, precisely, without obvious effort, in a way that made the excellence invisible because the excellence was so consistent that it stopped being noticed. She was also, from the first week, watching everything. She watched how the household budget worked, not just how she managed it, but how the numbers moved, where the margins were, how the vendor relationships were structured and which of them were well managed and which were not. She watched how Howard's business operated, not because he told her about it, he almost never discussed it with her, but because a household at this scale was adjacent to a business at this scale in ways that generated information if you were paying attention. The contractors who came to the house. The business associates who came to dinner and spoke freely at the table in the easy assumption that the woman managing the event was not listening to the content of the conversation. The documents that moved through the household's administrative life. The phone calls in the next room that carried more clearly than Howard seemed to realize. She listened. She noted. She built a picture of how a significant business operation actually functioned, the real architecture of it, not the surface that was presented in meetings, but the actual mechanics of supply and logistics and vendor management and the places where the numbers were telling one story to the outside world and a different story on the inside. She saved money. She did this carefully and without drama, in the way of someone who understands margins completely. The household allowance Howard gave her was substantial and reviewed twice a year without close examination. Adiz examined it with precision. Every efficiency she found, every saving she made, a portion went somewhere that was hers and only hers. Not enough to be noticed. Enough to accumulate. She called Emeka. Every week, sometimes more frequently. They talked the way siblings talk when they have decided to be allies, honestly, specifically, without the social performance that happens in conversations where you are not sure of the person you are talking to. She told him what she was learning. He told her what he was building. In the months after the marriage, Emeka had taken a decision of his own. He had been working in logistics, employed, making a reasonable wage, good at his job, and he had been watching the industry with the specific attention of someone trying to understand where the gap was between what existed and what was needed. He saw the gap. He had some savings. He made the decision to begin. The company he started was small. A logistics operation, one van, himself as the primary person doing everything, the driving, the client management, the administration, the planning. He did not take investment. He did not borrow significantly. He built it on exactly what he had and what each completed job added to it, because he understood that what he was building had to be clean. Adiz would need it to be clean. Whatever he built had to be the kind of thing that could be examined by anyone without difficulty, because when the time came, it was going to be examined. He said to her, during the second year of her marriage, in one of their weekly calls, "I am not going anywhere. Whatever you need when you are ready, I am building it. Just keep learning everything you can learn while you are there." She said, "I am learning everything." She was not exaggerating. In the third year of her marriage, Adiz found a lawyer. She found her through a path she had constructed with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. At one of Howard's dinners, a quarterly event for his business associates and their wives that Adiz managed and attended with the smooth professionalism of someone who had been doing it for years, she had spent time in conversation with a woman named Chinello, the wife of one of Howard's partners, who was also not what the dinner assumed she was. Chinello was in her mid-40s, composed, intelligent, and carrying in her manner the specific quality of someone who has been through something significant and come out on the other side of it knowing things she did not know before. They found each other in the way that certain women find each other at events where they are expected to be decorative, by being, under the decoration, actually paying attention to the same things. They exchanged numbers at the end of the evening without Howard noticing. They met for lunch 3 times over the following month. And on the third lunch, Chinello told Adiz about her divorce, about what it had cost to go in without preparation, and about the lawyer who had helped her understand the difference between being provided for and being protected. The lawyer's name was Mrs. Beatrice Ojo. She was 53 years old, compact and direct, with a practice specializing in matrimonial property law and a reputation in the specific community of women who had been through difficult marriages and needed to know exactly where they stood, for being the person you wanted in the room when the other side had more resources than you and expected that to be decisive. Adiz called her number 2 days after that third lunch. They met in Mrs. Ojo's office, a proper office, not above a pharmacy, a real legal practice with a receptionist and a conference room and bookshelves full of the particular kind of books that exist in legal offices. Mrs. Ojo listened to Adiz's situation with the focused attention of someone who has heard many versions of this particular story and knows precisely which details matter. Then she said, "You are not here because you are planning to leave." It was not a question. Adiz said, "I am here because I need to know exactly where I stand, in any eventuality." Mrs. Ojo said, "That is the right reason to be here." They met monthly after that, sometimes more frequently. Mrs. Ojo educated Adiz in the specific architecture of her legal position, what the matrimonial property laws of their jurisdiction said about spousal contributions to a household, what the discovery process in matrimonial litigation was capable of revealing, what the documentation of her household management was worth legally and what it was not, where her rights were and where they were not, and how the gap between those two things could be narrowed by preparation. Adiz was an excellent student. She had always been an excellent student. In the 4th year of the marriage, Howard Mensah told her he wanted a divorce. He told her on a Tuesday evening, in the sitting room, with the same matter-of-fact delivery that characterized his communication of all significant decisions. He had been developing a relationship with another woman. This was not new information to Adiz, who had been aware of the situation for some time through the particular alertness she maintained to everything in her environment. And the relationship had reached the point where Howard had decided it was the arrangement he preferred. He said he was sorry. He said she would be provided for. He said the legal process would be straightforward. Adiz said, "I see." She said it in the precise, quiet tone of a woman who has been expecting this conversation and is receiving it with exactly the amount of reaction it deserves. She called Mrs. Ojo from the bedroom that night. Mrs. Ojo said, "Are you ready?" Adiz said, "I have been ready for 11 months. Mrs. Ojo said, "Then we begin. Like this video. Subscribe if you have not already. Because what comes next is the part that makes everything that came before worth it." She called Emeka next. She said, "It is time." He said, "Are you ready?" She said, "I have been ready for 4 years." He said, "I know. I have been ready too." He had been. The logistics company had grown. Not dramatically, not at the pace it could have grown if Emeka had been willing to take the risks that would have accelerated it, but solidly. He had maintained it with the particular cleanliness of someone who knows they are building something that will eventually be examined and wants every examination to confirm what they intend it to confirm. He had taken only the work he could do well. He had built the reputation that comes from doing work well consistently. He had turned down deals that would have grown the company faster and taken it somewhere unstable. By the 4th year of Adi's marriage, he had something real. Something that could receive her. The divorce proceedings took 14 months. Howard Mentz's lawyers had structured their approach around a set of assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. They had assumed a woman who had spent 4 years being provided for would accept provision as a settlement. They had assumed the assets of the marriage were straightforward. They had assumed the primary lever in the negotiation was their client's ability to continue or discontinue a comfortable financial arrangement, and that this lever, applied with appropriate firmness, would produce a quick and relatively inexpensive resolution. They had not assumed Mrs. Beatrice Ojo. Mrs. Ojo had spent 11 months helping Adiz build a case that was thorough and well documented and that treated the 4 years of Adiz's management of Howard's household as what it actually was. A contribution to a commercial enterprise adjacent to the domestic one, documentable, quantifiable, and legally significant under the matrimonial property framework that applied. She had identified, through the careful review of the documents and records that Adiz had maintained with the precision of a woman who understood that the paperwork was not separate from the intention but was the concrete form the intention took. Exactly where the marriage's financial arrangements were and exactly what they were worth. The discovery process that Mrs. Ojo had requested, and that Howard's lawyers had initially expected to be a formality, turned out to be significantly more substantive than they had planned for. When financial arrangements that had been structured for certain purposes are examined by lawyers whose specific job is to examine them for different purposes, the structures sometimes reveal things that were not intended to be revealed. Howard Mentz's team spent 6 months managing the consequences of this and arrived at the settlement table with considerably less leverage than they had brought to their first conversation. The settlement that was eventually agreed upon was considerably more than Howard had expected to pay and precisely what Mrs. Ojo had believed was fair. Not generous in a way that was punitive. Fair in a way that was accurate. Adiz signed the final documents in Mrs. Ojo's conference room on a Thursday morning. She held the pen for a moment before signing. Then she signed. Then she sat with the document in front of her for a moment. She said, "Thank you." Mrs. Ojo said, "Thank yourself. You built this case with your own hands." She was right. Adiz Okonkwo left that marriage with enough to begin. She moved into a flat. Not large, not impressive, in the right part of the city for what she intended to do next. She unpacked 2 suitcases and a collection of books and the notes she had been keeping for 4 years, and she stood in the middle of the small sitting room and looked at the space and felt something she had not felt in 4 years. She felt like herself. Not a version of herself shaped by someone else's requirements. Not the person Howard had found useful to have beside him. Not the daughter her father had traded. The original version, the one who had sat at the kitchen table writing her supply chain assignment before her father came in and changed everything. That version. Still there. Waiting. She called Emeka. She said, "I need to finish the degree." He said, "How long?" She said, 8 months if I work consistently. He said, "Then we start the company in 8 months. I will be ready." She studied in the evenings and on the weekends. She took the degree she had started years earlier and finished it with the focused intensity of someone who has had a long time to think about why it matters. She did not approach it as coursework. She approached it as preparation. The difference was visible in the quality of what she produced. Her professors noted something in her final year's work that was different from the work of someone learning how business operates theoretically. There was a texture of someone who had already lived inside the machine. On the day she received the certificate, she sat in her flat with it in her hands for a long time. Then she called Emeka. She said, "Now." He said, "Now." What they built together over the next 6 years was not built quickly. This is an important thing to say clearly because there is a particular lie that certain kinds of success stories tell. The lie that the building was dramatic, that there was a moment of sudden transformation, that one decision or one opportunity changed everything overnight. That lie is appealing because it makes the story feel more like destiny and less like discipline. The truth of what Adiz and Emeka built is less dramatic and more important. It was built steadily. It was built carefully. It was built by two people who had each, over the previous decade, developed a specific and complementary understanding of how real things are made, not how they are presented, not how they appear, but how they actually hold together under pressure. Adiz brought the knowledge she had accumulated in 4 years inside Howard's household, the understanding of supply chains and vendor relationships and the specific mechanics of how money moves through a commercial operation when it is actually moving rather than when it is being described. She brought the negotiation skills she had developed across 4 years of managing relationships with contractors and vendors and business associates who had initially assumed she was simply the wife and had gradually, over the course of multiple interactions, been forced to update that assessment. She brought the financial discipline that had been in her since the beginning, the margin awareness, the waste intolerance, the particular attention to the gap between what things cost and what they are worth that had always made her excellent at anything that required her to understand the architecture of value. Emeka brought the company he had spent 4 years building into something real. He brought the reputation, the specific, earned, verified reputation that comes from years of showing up on time and delivering what you promised in an industry where both of those things are rarer than they should be. He brought the contacts who had come to trust him and who were therefore available to trust an expansion of what he had built if it was presented to them as an expansion rather than a replacement. He brought the steadiness that had been in him since the night he sat in the chair at his sister's desk and told her, "This is not the end of your story." They merged their capabilities into a trading and logistics company in the year after Adiz's degree certificate arrived. The company bore a name they had chosen together, not either of their names, a neutral professional name that did not carry any of the history they were both carrying, that could be presented to the world as simply what it was rather than what it meant to the two people who had built it. The first year was difficult. This is true of every real company in its first year, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a version of their story they have edited for palatability. Clients who agreed to work with them and then did not. A supplier relationship that turned out not to be what it appeared to be. Adiz recognized this early and severed it without sentiment, having spent 4 years learning to recognize exactly this kind of thing. Cash flow that required management with a precision that left no room for error. Emeka doing the operational work and Adiz doing the commercial work, and both of them doing the administrative work in the evenings because they had decided, without discussing it explicitly, that they were not going to take on overhead they had not yet earned. They survived the first year. They were better in the second. By the third year they had a reputation of their own. Not yet large, not yet the kind of reputation that people at certain levels of business were aware of, but solid. The kind of reputation that produces referrals. The kind of reputation that is earned rather than announced. In the 4th year of the company they landed a contract that changed the scale of everything. It came through the woman Adiz had met at one of Howard's dinners, not Chinello, a different woman, one who had watched Adiz manage the room and the relationships and the logistics of Howard's quarterly event and had thought, with the quiet recognition that certain business people develop for certain qualities. That woman understands how to move things from one place to another, which is the whole of what business is. The woman had sat on that thought for 2 years. When a contract in her own business required exactly the capabilities she had identified in Adiz that evening, the supply chain knowledge, the vendor management, the logistics precision, she had found Adiz's company and called. The contract was real and large and required everything they had. They delivered it completely and on time and to a standard that the client had not quite expected, having expected good rather than exceptional. The client told people. The people told people. The 4th year became the year the company stopped being a good small company and started being a company that certain significant players in certain industries began to know about. The company did not stop growing after that. It also did not become unrecognizable from what it had been. Two people who had decided what they were building and why, who kept the decision-making close, who kept the values threaded through everything. Transparency. Reliability. The particular care for the people who worked for them that comes from having been in a position where your own value was treated as someone else's to determine. They did not make that mistake with the people who worked for them. In the 5th year of the company, at the end of a quarter that had produced the best numbers they had ever produced, Adiz sat at her desk at the end of the working day and looked at the report in front of her. She sat with it for a while. Then she called Emeka. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "Do you remember what you told me? On the night Daddy told me about the marriage." He said, "I told you it was not the end of your story." She said, "Yes, you were right." He said, "I know." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Ada, you built this." She said, "We built this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, we did." In the 6th year of the company, Vincent Okonkwo came to see his daughter. He had heard about what she had built. The news had reached him through the particular intelligence network of extended family, not directly, not in any conversation he had been part of, but indirectly, through the way that a family's awareness of its members works when the members have become people that other people talk about. He had been hearing her name in different contexts for a year. He had sat with this information, turning it over the way he turned over everything that was complicated before deciding to come. He was 60 years old. He had aged in the specific way that men age when the foundation of their self-image turns out not to be what they believed. The business he had maintained for decades, the one with the appearance of solidity, the one around which his social identity had been structured, had not recovered. The debts he had cleared through Adi's marriage had returned in the way that debts return when the relationship with money that created them has not been changed. He was not in crisis. He was not destitute. He was simply reduced, carrying the specific diminishment of someone who watches something they traded away build itself into something they could not have built, and who has nowhere to put that knowledge except somewhere inside themselves where it lives quietly and permanently. He came to her office on a Tuesday morning. Her office, in the building that bore the company name on its glass door, that housed 30 employees in its current scale, that had won 2 industry recognitions in the previous year, and through the window of which, behind his daughter's desk, the organized productive activity of a genuinely alive and growing business was visible. Adiz had known he was coming. Her assistant had called to confirm the appointment. She had sat with the knowledge for 3 days and decided, with the care she brought to all decisions that mattered, how she would handle it. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her desk. He said her name, Ada, the name he had always called her. His Ada, his brightest one. She said yes. He said he had heard about what she had built. He said it with the particular care of a man choosing each word, which she had noticed her father doing more frequently in recent years, the care of someone who understands that the ground has shifted and that the words that worked before may not work now. He said he was proud of her. He said it carefully. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Daddy, I am not going to have the conversation where we try to decide whether what you did was what you believe it was or what I know it was. I am 32 years old. You are 60. That conversation is one neither of us needs. What I am going to tell you instead is something I have thought about carefully." He waited. She said, "I built this in spite of what you did. Not because of it. I want to be clear about that distinction because it matters. What you did cost me things I did not get back. Cost me years. It cost me the ability to trust you in the way a daughter should be able to trust her father, which is a cost I did not agree to pay and which you did not have the right to make me pay. Those costs are real, and I am not going to pretend they are not real to make this conversation easier." He was very still. She said, "And I am also not going to tell you that I am done being your daughter. I am not done. That is not who I am. You are still my father. But what that means between us now is going to be defined by me. On my terms. Not by the family's expectations, not by what is traditional, not by what makes other people comfortable. By me. Do you understand what I am telling you?" He said, "Yes, I understand." She said, "Good." She stood up. She came around her desk and she stood before him and she put her arms around him. Not the embrace that forgives everything, not the embrace that returns things to what they were before, but the embrace of a woman who has done the inventory of what she is willing to carry and what she is not, and who has arrived at peace with what the inventory contains. An honest embrace, not a complete one. Then she stepped back. She said, "I have a meeting at 11. My assistant will take care of you." She returned to her desk. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. "Now I want to stop here for a moment, because there is something I need you to understand about what Adi's story is and what it is not. It is not a story about a daughter who forgave her father. She has not forgiven him, not fully, not yet, perhaps not ever in the simple sense of that word. Forgiveness, if it comes, will come on her terms and in her own time, and it will not be announced, and it will not be performed, and it will not be produced for anyone's comfort. It is not a story about a daughter who destroyed her father either. She could have. In the 6th year of a successful company, she had resources that would have made his diminishment complete and permanent if she had chosen to use them that way. She did not choose that. What it is a story about is harder and more specific than either of those. It is a story about a woman who had her future sold without her consent, who survived what was done to her, who built something real and undeniable from the pieces of what she had been given, including the pieces she had been given without her permission, and who arrived at a position of sufficient power that she got to determine, on her own terms, what relationship she would have with the person who had sold her. The power to determine. Not the power to punish. Not the power to perform either reconciliation or rejection for the audience of the family or the community or anyone else. Simply the power to decide what the terms are, from a position where the decision is genuinely and fully hers. That is the thing that was taken from her at the kitchen table on the evening her father came in from the dinners she had not been invited to. And that is the thing she took back. And Emeka. Do not forget Emeka. Chukwemeka Okonkwo sat in a chair at his sister's desk on the night their father arranged her marriage and said, "This is not the end of your story." And then he did the specific and difficult work of making that sentence true over the 10 years that followed. Not through confrontation, the confrontation had happened and had not changed what could not be changed. Through building. Through making the company he knew she would need. Through the weekly calls during the years of the marriage when she was learning everything and needed someone to tell, and through the quiet, consistent reliability of showing up and staying and being the one thing in her life from that night forward that she could count on completely. That is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It does not make speeches. It does not require recognition. It simply does the work of being present and being ready and making sure that when the person you love is ready to step into something solid, the solid thing is there. Find your Emeka, or be someone else's Emeka. The world needs more of both. So here is what I want to leave with you today. If someone has sold your future to pay their debt, if someone has used your life as currency without your consent, if someone who was supposed to protect you has decided instead to spend you, you are allowed to feel every layer of what that is. The anger and the grief and the specific, disorienting betrayal of discovering that the foundation you thought you were standing on was not what it appeared. You are allowed to sit on the edge of a bed and understand it completely and feel all of it. And then, you are allowed to pick up every piece of knowledge that the experience gave you, including the knowledge that was given without your permission, the knowledge absorbed from within rooms you did not choose to be in, and use it. Build from it. Turn the structure that was supposed to contain you into the architecture you understand better than anyone else in the room. Because here is what the people who trade futures do not understand. When they put you in a room, they put you in a room with information. When they build a structure around you without your consent, they give you an education in how that structure actually works from the inside. Not how it looks from the outside, not how it presents itself to the world, but how it actually holds together and where it is weak and where the margins are and how the money really moves. The woman they thought they were managing was managing herself all along. Quietly, precisely, with the focused intelligence of someone who had decided, on the edge of a bed, on the night the deal was made without her, that this was not where her story ended. That the room had a door, that she was going to find it, and she did. God does not waste what you have been through. Not a year of it. Not a single thing that was done to you without your consent. All of it becomes something raw material education, the specific knowledge that only comes from having been inside the thing rather than watching it from the outside. Every room you were put in without your permission was also a room with a door. You were always going to find it. Go and find it. And then go and build. If the story found you today, if some part of it sat in your chest in a way that felt like recognition, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me who your Emeka is. Tell me what you are building. Like this video if it moved something in you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who tried to use them gave them something to build with. Subscribe to African Tales by Charlie. New stories every day. For the ones who are still building. I will see you in the next one.